So Simon Martin is next from DICE. I think you can share your screen and you'll also have 10 minutes. Thank you, by the way, everyone. This is very interesting. So let's go.
Okay, hello, welcome. My name is Simon and I'm a postdoc at DICE. And I will present a paper about market transparency and consumer search with some evidence from the German retail gasoline market. Okay, so what's this all about? Well, market transparency is and has been an ongoing important policy issue in various jurisdictions. For instance, we're told that we need more transparency in order to improve the consumer information and to facilitate comparison of prices. But some governments have gone even one step further. On top of just telling us that this would be a great thing to have, they've started initiating government-operated comparison websites themselves. For instance, for financial products, for energy markets, and as most relevant for my today's talk, in retail gasoline markets. Now, this triggers a fairly big question to ask, namely whether these policies are any effective in actually promoting competition and increasing consumer welfare. That was how they were designed. Are they actually delivering? The application that I'm presenting today is, from my point of view, a fairly ideal application to discuss this question, retail gasoline markets. And the reason I believe that they are a quite good application is that, first of all, I will try to convince you that with fairly good hope to estimate the degree of product differentiation in that market. That's the first reason. And the second reason is that we observe very interesting variation in how precisely these transparency measures are implemented across countries. Okay, take for instance Germany and France. There is a transparency regime in place, which I will refer to as full transparency, and I will be more precise about it in a minute, what exactly this means. Whereas in Austria, there's only a restricted transparency regime in place. Okay, let me show you what this looks like. Okay, so both in Austria and in Germany, by law, gasoline stations are mandated to transmit the prices to a central database whenever they change them. And they change them actually quite frequently, up to 5 times a day. Okay, now you as a consumer, you can look up some of these gasoline prices online. Now, suppose you want to do this in somewhere in Germany, for instance, in Mannheim. You look up one of these government-operated or government-filled websites, and you're presented with all the prices, the entire universe of gasoline prices that you could possibly be interested in. Okay, this is a fully transparent environment. Everything that's stored in the database is made available to consumers. Now, in contrast, suppose you want to do the same thing in Austria. You look up on one of these government-operated websites. Again, in this database, all the prices are stored. But what you are shown as a consumer is only the subset of cheapest prices in this website, okay? In this database. For the remainder, all you're told is, well, there is another gasoline station there, but we're not telling you the price. It's not among the cheapest. Okay, there's a restricted transparency regime in place. Now, the question that I'm asking in this paper is, what are first of all, the effects of transparency in markets with these types of information frictions? And where I eventually want to go, or I am or actually going, is to conduct some counterfactual policy simulation. What is the effect on prices and consumer welfare by changing the transparency regime? What is the likely outcome on prices if Germany were to adopt an Austrian type of restricted transparency regime? Okay, how do I approach this question? Well, I start off with a model in the spirit of Varian and also with taking some elements from Ralph Tomlinson's paper. And then I estimate a structural model of the German retail gasoline market. I consider a setting in which there is both some horizontal and vertical differentiation. Now, I understand that some people may view gasoline as a fairly homogeneous product, which I believe is true to a certain extent. But I would say that there's still definitely a horizontal aspect. You know, a gasoline station which is 200 kilometers away from you might be much less appealing to you than one which is just located next door. And vertical differentiation, well, at least some consumers may view gasoline of different brands of higher value, or also simply value the fact that there are some maybe additional amenities like car wash or in-shop facilities. There's also fairly high volatility in these markets. I distinguish between two types of consumers: uninformed consumers who basically are not affected by prices that are shown online. You know, think of them as like out of habit, they would charge or use the same gasoline station all the time. And then on top of that, there is consumers who look up prices online and are hence affected by the transparency regime. And then basically they make a discrete choice of gasoline station conditional on their consideration set. Since I do not find any evidence for mixed strategies, I cast this as a game of incomplete information. This incomplete information aspect then gives rise to uncertainty both in prices and in rankings. And in terms of estimation, I employ a flexible two-stage approach, which is conceptually similar to what other people have done in the auctions or dynamic games literature, and a proxy for demand using publicly available buildings data. Okay, so what I'm doing is basically I throw a large artificial fishnet over entire Germany, and based on publicly available buildings information, I can construct a measure of population density in each of these small grid cells. And from these grid cells, I can then compute the driving distance to each of the gasoline stations. And basically then the total demand that each gasoline station faces consists of the weighted sum of all these representative consumers from all of these detailed grid cells. Okay, so I think that's quite a novelty to use this public data here. What do I find? Well, most importantly, that consumers can be better off if being given strictly less information, but not too little. Okay, so in Germany, the benchmark status quo is a fully transparent environment. What happens if we restrict transparency relative to that? In particular, what I find is what is consumer welfare optimal is restricting transparency to showing only the top or the first 20% of prices, in which case the consumer expenditures would decrease by around 1.2%. But this is partially mitigated by inefficient matching. So consumer welfare increases by the equivalent of around 4% of the firm's current margins. Now you may wonder, why could the prices be lower when consumers are being shown only less information? And the reason is the following, that when firms understand that consumers who look up prices online would only consider them if they made it to the top 20% of prices, then this opens up an additional channel for competition, namely competing for attention. Okay, so in a way, this becomes almost like an auction. The firms understand that they additionally need to compete on this margin in order to even make it to the consumer's consideration set. And if this effect is sufficiently strong, then the total prices may decrease, and that is precisely what I find here. I find, you may wonder, then maybe we should decrease prices even further. And it's true that possibly prices would decrease additionally, but the matching becomes eventually terribly inefficient. So what I find in total is that consumer welfare is inverse U-shaped in transparency. And yeah, I think also like as a methodological contribution, I think the framework that I propose here allows estimating discrete choice models with incomplete information using price data only. Okay, so using this approach for proxying for demand, publicly available buildings data, I think that's quite nicely applicable to other settings where we have rich access to data to rich access to rich pricing data, but possibly no quantity data, which makes more standard approaches much more. 2 minutes, perfect. So like just basically the same what I just mentioned now as a graph again. So basically we're starting with a fully transparent benchmark, basically where the transparency regime rho equals 1. So we're starting at the right part of the graph. So if we were to restrict transparency relative to that, and I'd like to draw your attention to the solid line, which represents the consumer welfare. So basically, if we restrict transparency relative to a fully transparent benchmark, initially this improves consumer welfare, which peaks at the transparency regime of around 0.2, that is showing the top 20% of prices only. But if we were to restrict further, then consumer welfare would go down. And I think a similar image appears for the prices. A second set of counterfactual that I'm considering is basically what would happen if we were to exogenously convince more consumers to look up information online. Now, this would be definitely good in terms of consumer welfare, but it's maybe much harder to achieve to convince more consumers to look up information online than merely changing a transparency regime. Okay, yeah, so basically just to conclude, so I think the transparency regulation needs to take into account the firm's equilibrium response, and that is in particular here the incentives to be displayed, competing for attention, but all at the same time are striking a trade-off with matching efficiency. So theoretically, restricting transparency may lead to lower prices, and I find that this is really relevant in Germany. And yeah, as I said, this methodology that I'm proposing here would be applicable to numerous other settings, and I'll be glad to chat in detail about the paper itself in the poster room or anything else that may else be based on it. Thank you.